Good morning and welcome. Great to see you here. If you're walking past and wonder what we're going to be talking about, the theme for today is emerging connectivity for live production, and I'll explain a bit about what that means as we get going. So greetings. It's good to be here. I've been dashing to and from Europe to the US the last couple of weeks for a variety of events, and it's great to be here today. One little plug before we get into the content. I enjoy conversations on technology for broadcast with people. So a little plug. There is a podcast called Time for Tea with Andy. So do search it out if you're interested. We cover a variety of different technical topics. The reason for the tea is that I love cups of tea, and I have to say, to be honest, you don't do tea that well this side of the pond. And the ice cream is one of my favorite questions for everyone is, what's your favorite flavor ice cream? So if you ever want to come on the podcast, then do join me, and it'll be good to understand that. So I'm going to expand the title very slightly just to explain where I'm going. So from emerging connectivity for live production, emerging and evolving connectivity for live production, because we're not really making too many step changes here, but really this is by way of a tutorial of how we're doing connectivity for live production now, and some of the buzzwords that have been coming in the last few months and how that plays. And if any of you were SVG yesterday, there were one or two things that came out, which I think is probably worth me expanding on as well. But I just thought, as a light-hearted kickoff, there was a quote that I found at the weekend about the unlikeliness of television to ever be generally available to the public. That was from the president of AT&T back almost 100 years ago. So interesting observation, and thankful for us and our careers that that's not actually been the truth. I also stood up about 30 years ago and actually said we would never use IP for professional television production connectivity at a show. So just want to show that everyone makes mistakes and everyone has wrong visions when they actually make statements. And I had hair back then as well. Anyway, almost 100 years of television we're celebrating around this time. And the way people consume television, but also more importantly for today, the way people produce television has changed dramatically in those 100 years. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. So this is kind of obviously a very general view of the live production workflow, from wherever the acquisition is through to all of that production processing in the middle, through to the actual consumption. And we're going to unpack the journey of the connectivity and signals that flow there. Now, this is a piece of work that the DPP did 5 years ago during lockdown period. I remember being in the discussions. And this is just looking at the models of the way we create live production now. So at the very top there's the traditional model where your acquisition, your control, and all your processing equipment is co-located. Then we've got these variety of other models now, some of which are accelerated by COVID, but largely we've actually got very different ways of abstracting the acquisition location from the equipment that's doing the processing and storage from the people that are controlling it. And that's the great thing about having IP infrastructure throughout the system. And we're going to unpack what that means a little bit later on. Okay. Slightly complicated slide, but I want to unpack this just for a couple of minutes because I think this is a good hold on how we are doing connectivity today for broadcast connectivity, specifically for live production. So on the left-hand side, we've got what I call the compression and transport options. So the flavors of options we have for doing connectivity and transport at the moment. The top two, 2110, which I love being part of, and it was great to be part of the Emmy reception last week to celebrate that. 2022-6, which was a precursor to 2110, which was really just taking an SDI stream in it and wrapping it with IP packets. We've then got various compression options, which are proliferating. There is a significant rise, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute, of JPEG XS using TR07 or TR08. We'll come to that in a minute. JPEG 2000, which has been in use for the last almost 20 years now. And then AVC and HEVC as the two main compression formats for what I call aggressive or temporal compression. So that's how we do transport today in carrying all of those different our broadcast signals, our live broadcast signals. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram is what I call the protection and healing. And this is the ways we give those signals integrity. As you know, live broadcast content is very high value. In fact, some of the sporting events that we handle, unbelievably high value. So the integrity of that connectivity is absolutely paramount, as well as the quality. So we've got the 2022-7, which I call RTP merge. That's the technology where we can have a spatially diverse transit of the signals, and we merge them at the receiving end. So you've basically, the hit you take is double bandwidth. The beauty of it is it's a latency-free way of doing unbelievably good protection. And that has actually, that's almost in continual use both within facilities and on wide area interconnect nowadays. We've obviously got the technique which has been around for many decades now of doing FEC, and we can apply that to our long haul connectivity for broadcast. And then the emergence in relatively recent times of ARQ technology. As you're probably well aware, the way we transport everything on the left, all of those flavors of compression and transport on the left, in the IP world are transported using a protocol called UDP. And that is inherently fragile. It's a non-handshaking technology. So what we have done on the right-hand side with ARQ technology more recently, and SRT is probably the most common one, but there's also RIST available that was developed by VSF. What we do with those is we actually re-request the information that doesn't get through. So it's a re-request. As you will have instantly realized, that takes time. So because you've actually got to have the transit path, and you've got to have a re-request, then send it again. So there is a penalty, but it does mean you can transform unreliable connectivity into a way of carrying pristine live broadcast signals. And one of the things that has changed, I think, dramatically in the last 10 years is the use of non-managed internet connectivity for live production. That pre-COVID, that was almost a no-no. Everyone used private leased lines for very, very significant costs, but they behaved very well because carrier provided leased lines a very, very, very good performance. What we are now able to do in a lot of cases is use unmanaged internet connectivity, which is generally orders of magnitude less in price, less in cost, and then use these technologies, these protocols, to actually make it behave as well as it needs to for what we want. So that's kind of the picture of where we're at today. And almost everyone that's doing live broadcasting is using one or more of these technologies, and you could do mix and match as well. So, there are some advantages to some of them and others not. Probably just worth saying that on the left-hand side, from a latency perspective, 2110 and 2022-6 are effectively uncompressed. There is no hit from the compression, so it's really only the buffering through the system that you're costing. JPEG XS as a compression technology was designed to be ultra low latency. The actual compression end-to-end mechanism is sub 1 millisecond. So it's almost negligible when you're going long, wide area, long distance. So really it's the buffering technologies. It's the buffering and the actual transit time that dominates. HEVC and AVC are technologies that involve compression. We've done a lot of work both within our organization and other vendors as well in optimizing that latency, but it's still very much a slightly more latent transport mechanism. So the more bandwidth you throw at it, in general, the less latency you have to incur. There are some exceptions there, but that's generally the rule. So that's where we're sitting right now. So one observation, what I'm calling the rise and rise of TR07. If I just flip back to that diagram just again to show you, JPEG XS, which is the very lightweight sub-millisecond compression, has two encapsulation options. TR08, which is when you carry it as a 2110 essence. And then there's TR07, which is when we wrap it in a transport stream. Now, I have to admit, if we go back 5 years ago, I really didn't think that was actually going to catch on. But now, that has actually been enormously successful. Two main reasons, I think. One is people are very used to handling transport streams. Secondly, the forward clocking architecture of it means we don't have to have concern about PTP, GNSS reference, frequency synchronous PTP referencing at each side of the chain. We can actually have forward clocking, downward clock recovered architectures that would actually consume this. And that's actually immensely important, especially when you're doing live production from locations where you can't necessarily guarantee timing reference. There was an interesting discussion on Monday at the VSF event that we had here in New York on the requirements for having more and more audio available within TR07 to support many, many more multi-language and Atmos, other surround technologies as well. So this standard is definitely evolving, or the use cases, the use points, the operating points within the standard are evolving. So watch this space, because this is definitely on the rise. And of the JPEG XS deployments that we're seeing in the industry and we're involved in, almost all of them are now using TR07, which is an interesting observation. Now, don't forget the long-haul audio production audio. So I just talked about some of the requirements for maybe adding more audios within TR07. But I think one of the observations I've had as we do production audio, especially for REMI, where we're actually doing remote production, where we need to backhaul all of the ISOs of the video and all of the ISOs of the audio. And that can be a lot of stuff. And actually, there's a technology that's really had a resurgence in the last 10 years called MADI, which basically has, and I think the reason that that's had so much success, again, is it's a forward clocking technology. AES67 natively, as you use it, it's fantastic in a local area network where you've got pristine PTP timing reference, works like a dream. If we've got any long haul where we've actually got some concerns potentially about end-to-end frequency lock, then AES67 and the other derivatives, more proprietary derivatives in audio workflows can actually be challenged. So there's actually some work we need to do more here. And I've put that 5 millisecond thing on the right hand side there, because the one observation when we start to think more about remote production, the one thing that you just can't negotiate on at all is the audio back to people's ears at the production. Almost everything else, there is some degree of flexibility on latency. But that number there, which is really the limit on what people can cope with latency back to their ears, means that we have to do local loop audio somehow at the location, even if everything else gets remoted in terms of the way the production's done. Very happy to talk to you about more of these moving forward. On Monday, we did actually have a discussion about whether we actually need as an industry to make a forward clocking variant of the AES67, so that actually we can actually make the best of the AES67 world, but also have a more robust architecture for how we do audio as we do long haul, especially for REMI. So that's some work, and several industry other players I've been talking to about that moving forwards. So why not the latest and greatest? I've talked about those 4 compression technologies, which you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. The top 2 are the wavelet-based mezzanine compressions, and the bottom 2 are capable of being either temporal or non-temporal compressions. There are more modern compression tools coming around, and why are we not considering using them? And what the main thing I think I want to emphasize here is the importance of the difference between acquisition and production and distribution. In distribution, we're fighting for every kilobit per second of bandwidth, because the channels to your mobile device, the channels of bandwidth to your home to actually optimize delivery there, every kilobit per second, or every certain tens of kilobits per second really, really counts in that environment. Where we're at, and also the other thing to say about distribution largely is it's a one-to-many. And as you're very aware that the reason MPEG was developed with the heavy asymmetry of complexity between encode and decode is because you encode once, you receive many times. In the contribution and production space, we actually almost have an equivalence of transmits and receives, largely speaking. So we can afford to have a more complex receiver, but we don't necessarily need to have a very, very, very complex encoder, because the bandwidth is not as critical in general for acquisition and production as it is for distribution. So these newer technologies, VVC and AV1, have been very much optimized for delivery rather than contribution, which is why sticking with these more mature, slightly less efficient compression technologies on the left is actually the way we're going to continue to roll for most of acquisition and production infrastructure. Time. Now, latency is a big bugbear of mine, and I think in a lot of implementations we see unnecessary latency being introduced. There is only one fundamental latency that we can't negotiate that, and that's the speed of light in fiber, which is 2 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. So that's the actual, that's the non-negotiable. In general, that actually is not that much of an issue for most production, even REMIs, even transcontinental REMIs can actually cope with that largely, as long as there's not other excess buffering within there. I talked about ARQ, we talked about SRT and RIST, etc. just now, that there is a round trip time thing. So you do have to be aware that if you're starting to use ARQ technologies to protect, then there is some additional cost. And if you're going transatlantic or other transcontinental routes, then you do need to be more careful about those ARQ round trips. Now, this is where I just want to start to address some of the emerging technology that we've been talking about this year. We're moving from bespoke to generic in broadcast. Many of us grew up with a BNC connector and an XLR connector for our video and audio. More and more devices are now Ethernet interfaced. So as broadcasters, we're not responsible for the physical layer connector. We used to worry about eye height in those signals and all of those things. And back in the analog days, the sub-carrier amplitude, all of those things. We've been abstracted away from that. And that's a good thing, because the IT industry is massively bigger than the broadcast industry. So everything and anything we can do to ride on the back of the IT industry is great, because we can leverage scale. So we are actually, there's connectivity, there's virtualization, where we actually take specific functions and put them in software rather than having them in bespoke hardware. Dematerialization, where we take those functions and we don't even have them locally. They're actually hosted somewhere else on our behalf. Networking, I think I've already talked about the ubiquity of low Earth orbit satellite, 5G connectivity, as well as vastly increased performance in unmanaged internet connectivity in general has facilitated great advances there, and much, much more economic ways of doing production. Now, compute in live production. This has been the holy grail people have been working to for a long time. It's been working back down the value chain. Playout is almost entirely software-based now, and it's matured. It's done very well by many vendors. Using compute for all the rest of the live production chain is something that's still very much an emerging technology, but compute now is ready for it, which is the great thing. So we have the capability to support that. So I just want to look at some of those interface formats that I've talked about earlier. So going back from the last 90 years or so, when we had our original analog specifications for linear transmission of video, we then had all the digital formats in SDI, and we then started wrapping them into IP, ended up with the most recent, most used is 2110, and obviously that's an excellent standard for use within facilities, between equipment, between cameras, etc. But this year is really a crunch point in terms of how we handle that when we go into compute, because compute is very different. And as we're starting to move our live production chain into compute, we need to think about a few more things. So what we have here, this is roughly where we're heading as an industry in the typical workflow that we're going to have. We're going to have some linear connectivity, traditional synchronous connectivity, such as 2110 or HEVC or XS over transport stream, whatever those flavors are, from the cameras, from the acquisition points, the microphones. Then we're going to be going into this asynchronous world of compute, where we're actually handling most of those live production workflow steps within software. And then we're going to go back to a linear dissemination to get towards the points of distribution. So that's roughly where we're speaking. There's a big question as to where those boundaries are. And I want to just explain compute and how it works for a moment. So I got my grandson to hold a hose pipe for me a few weeks ago. So you can see on the left there. And that's my attempt just to give you a vision of what our linear synchronous connectivity looks like. It's a continual flow of data, be that packets, or in SDI, be that bits, or back in the analog days, be that of an analog waveform. And it's continual. And the great thing about that has been, A, we know how to make it behave well, and B, the inference of the timing of different parts of the signal can be done very easily because it's a constant linear flow of data. How compute works well is it does a bunch of math on a bunch of data as quickly as it possibly can, vastly quicker than real time in the broadcast world, and then shoves it over. So as we move into the compute piece, we're moving from hose pipes with this linear flow into buckets of water. So big buckets handle lots of data very quickly, then we move over. And there's several pieces of work that have been done in the industry, starting with AWS's CDI about 6 years ago or so. The VSF has been working, and then recently the EBU has done some work on there. And we're going to come to that. But looking back at that picture I showed you a couple of times ago, this is another view of that now. As we go from linear, from the acquisition, into this nonlinear time-aware piece, then back to the finished media. Now, what we've done in the past when we've defined specified interfaces, we've focused on an interface. We haven't thought so much about the end-to-end system requirements. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. That was true with SDI. That was true with 2110. So going back to this picture, we've got this juncture where we're actually going from linear synchronous into this asynchronous compute world and back again. So one of the things we need to do is make sure we propagate time. I said about the hose pipe. If you've got a hose pipe, you know roughly the sequencing of the data, the water, the data as we flow through. You can infer timing. If you've just got buckets, you've got no idea where you're at. So as we move to asynchronous connection for live connectivity for live media within the compute, then we need to actually have this origin time and be able to propagate that through the system. It's also very important when we're coming back on doing replays, when we need to synchronize ISOs, etc. Those are just two use cases. Now, I've talked about latency of transport. There is also some latency challenges within the way we do live production. So back in the SDI days, most good switches were down to maybe 6 lines, SDI lines of latency, so well sub-millisecond latency. When we introduced 2110, we had this parameter called TR offset, and everyone's been scared to use anything other than a non-zero value. So everyone just puts a frame store in. So a vision switcher has gone from being 6 lines of latency in the SDI world to being a whole frame just because we're scared of TR offset. And in general, a general observation, in compute, as we've gone to software, most people have actually made things work well by putting in tons of buffers. And buffers cost time. A lot of that's unnecessary because if you look at the bottom bit there, because compute generally works quite a bit faster than real time, as long as we know the timing information about each of those clumps of media data in our nonlinear transport, we can concatenate a bunch of processing that's faster than real time. So actually we can produce very low latency production chains because of letting software do what it does and do things well. Obviously, there's prerequisites about the data being available from the different feeds, etc., to do the math. But the math can be done as quickly as possible, as soon as possible in these, as long as we've got the timestamps. Just another myth on timing, just a bust. There's been lots of talks about compute needing to understand time very precisely. NTP is well good enough within compute. We do not need PTP precision in compute. The only time we need precision timing within our whole workflow of connectivity is the point of acquisition. We need to understand the time, the moment in time the video frame was captured, the audio sample was taken. Once we've done that, it's just maths and actually allowing a window. At some point, obviously at the end, we need to reconstruct a linear. That may in the future only be on someone's television or mobile device, but it may be elsewhere in the production chain. But we don't need that precision time. There's a whole load of stuff been happening, as I alluded to, in the last couple of years on how we actually converge on this asynchronous piece in the middle. And the EBU's work on dynamic media facility is really where that's converging this year. And there's been some exciting changes. So several of us have been playing in this space for the last couple of years within standards work and as individual organizations. But we've converged on this media exchange layer. There's some excellent talks that you can hear from people involved in the EBU work there on the media exchange. So I'm not going to dive into that now, but just to say, thinking about this emerging connectivity piece that we're talking about, there's a ton of other stuff as well as the acquisition time we really want to get from the source, including where it was located, the camera movement, the camera positioning, etc. A lot of that is important information that we may well need downstream in the system. So the preservation of metadata is really, really important. It's something as an industry we haven't got right yet. So there's some future work we have to do to preserve metadata, both timing and positional, etc. as well. Also, you've probably heard the talk about TAMS, which is a BBC R&D initiative. And it's talking about moving from the signal-centric world, which I've been largely describing in the last few minutes, to storage-centric, where we can actually let everyone that uses that information in near real time for post and other AI type applications straight away off the back by the way the storage is honed in. And the important thing is that it's actually tied in with the transport connectivity we're talking about. As I said, there's more work to be done. I just want to shout out specifically how we actually do precise timing within our contribution. Now, as I say, we're going to keep to those same technologies, but we need to overlay that with more precise timing information. So this is kind of a quick summary of where we're at today, both in that asynchronous world and with the system level thinking that actually needs to pervade that as we move forward. Elephant in the room, control. Once again, a bit like 2110 with NMOS that came later, we need to really, really make sure as we start to look at this whole chain propagation, we get the control piece. I don't even know if the elephant in the room is an expression in the USA. Is it? Yeah, is it still a thing? Okay, that's very cool. So jumping back to here, just want to summarize. The future is hybrid. We're going to have linear connectivity in our chain. We're going to have asynchronous connectivity in our chain. We need to make sure those work together as a seamless tool. So to allow us to produce and to allow all of the automatic information and the reconciliation that's needed. So here's a quick summary. Horses for courses. Is that an expression over here as well? So we need to use the right technology. So just for clarity, MXL has its place in compute. So it's within intra and intercompute. All of these other technologies will continue to be used for the linear connectivity piece as we move forwards. Okay. Just end with another quote from a prime minister in the UK, back from 1938. Again, thankfully for all of us, he got it wrong as well, which is very good. So I'd like to end as usual by saying if you're ever in the UK and want to join me for a proper cup of tea, you'll be very welcome. Give me a shout. I think we've got about 2 minutes for any quick questions. If we after that, I'm very happy to hang around our booth. The Appear booth is literally behind you there, so you can come and find us, but I'll hang around here if anyone wants to chat after. Anyone got a quick question just as we end? No, everyone's bamboozled. Or you want to go for your lunch. It's one or the other. Anyway, I'll be around. We'd love to catch up with you. You can reach out to me on email or on my cell if you want to talk further on any of these topics. That would be great. Thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for your time.